Angus King is back in the U.S. after his trip to Lithuania for the NATO summit. He met diplomats and world leaders and received updates on Russia's attack on Ukraine.
King says his meetings were positive and that NATO is more unified and stronger than ever thanks to the unprovoked actions of Vladimir Putin. He also says the first good news during the summit was Turkey's agreement to stand aside and accept the admission of Sweden into NATO.
But Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed frustrations about Ukraine's path to NATO membership. King says after Zelensky met with President Biden, he lessened his rhetoric.
And I understand President Zelensky's frustration. He's in a huge crisis where his people are being bombed, civilians are being bombed, hospitals, schools. They're in a real shooting war. And he wants to move forward with NATO membership as soon as possible. On the other hand, I think President Biden is right, and other members, by the way, it's not just the United States, other members have reservations about a short-term accession of Ukraine to NATO.
King says putting Ukraine on a fast track for NATO membership could prolong the war in Russia. King visited Ukraine in January and met with Zelensky to pledge his support for Ukrainian democracy. And Senator King treated his colleagues to a Maine delicacy yesterday. His office says that once the Senate trip to the NATO summit in Lithuania concluded, King and his colleagues flew back to resume Senate business today. But they had to make a stop to refuel in Maine. That could only mean one thing, a lobster layover at the Bangor Aviation's International Terminal. King's office worked to have the dinner ready for everyone on board when they arrived.